The rain tapped softly against the large glass windows of the gas station where I worked. It was a typical night, the kind that seemed to stretch into eternity. Most of my shifts blurred together after a while. Working the night shift was no one's dream job, but I needed the money, and it was quiet. Too quiet. I checked the clock. 2:15 a.m. The dead zone of the night. No customers. No noise outside except the gentle rain. I leaned back in my chair, absent-mindedly scrolling through my phone. I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow over the aisles. That was when the door's chime broke the stillness. The bell wasn't loud, but in the silence, it was like a gunshot. I looked up, expecting a drenched traveler or a drunk stumbling in for cigarettes. Instead, there was no one. The door was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze, but the doorway was empty. I stood up slowly, scanning the parking lot through the sheets of rain. Not a car in sight. Strange. I walked around the counter to the door and pushed it shut, listening for footsteps, laughter, anything to explain the mysterious entry. Nothing. The rain was coming down harder now, the rhythmic patter louder, drowning out the hum of the lights. I locked the door and turned back towards the counter, brushing it off as a trick of the wind. As I returned to my post, I heard a noise. Not from outside. No, it came from the far corner of the store, by the freezer. It was a soft, scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I stopped, straining my ears. There it was again, a low, metallic scrape. My heart raced as I walked down the aisles toward the sound. The freezer door was cracked open. I distinctly remembered closing it earlier. I always checked that before settling in for the night. Cold air seeped out, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I leaned forward, peering into the icy darkness inside. Nothing. I shut the door firmly, backing away, but as soon as I turned, the sound returned. This time it was closer, louder. I whipped around, eyes scanning the shelves, the corners, every shadow. There was no one. My mind was playing tricks on me, I convinced myself. I hadn't been sleeping well, and the solitude was getting to me. I hurried back to the counter, suddenly uneasy. That's when the lights flickered, once, twice, then darkness. The hum of the lights ceased, plunging the store into silence. The only light now came from the emergency exit sign, a faint red glow that barely illuminated the rows of snacks and drinks. I fumbled for my phone, using the screen to guide me as I searched for the circuit breaker. I had to get the lights back on. As I moved, the scraping sound returned, louder than before, and now there was something else. Breathing. It was heavy, labored, like someone trying to stifle it, but failing. It was close, too close. My skin crawled as I whipped around, my phone's light shaking in my hand. The beam caught something, a figure, hunched over, barely visible in the dim glow, standing just behind the shelves. I froze. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs too long for its frame. Its face, what I could see of it, was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the darkness. It watched me, motionless. The breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. Then, in a jerking motion, it started moving toward me, its limbs creaking with each step. The scraping sound returned, louder and faster, as though something sharp was being dragged along the floor. I stumbled backward, crashing into a display of chips, sending bags scattering across the floor. My phone slipped from my hand, skidding into the shadows. The figure was almost upon me now. Its eyes locked on mine, its mouth slowly curling into a grin, revealing rows of teeth that seemed too long, too sharp. I crawled backward, frantically searching for something, anything to defend myself with. My hand found a broom, and I swung it wildly, but the figure was unfazed, its pace relentless. I scrambled to my feet, racing toward the back room, heart pounding in my chest. The door slammed behind me as I locked it, leaning against the cold metal, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Silence again. The only sound was the rain, still tapping at the windows. My eyes darted around the room. I needed to call for help. I grabbed the landline, fingers shaking as I dialed. No signal. Of course, I cursed under my breath. In the eerie quiet, I could hear it again. That breathing. It was right outside the door now. I held my breath, trying to listen. The doorknob rattled gently, then twisted. My heart stopped. The lock held, but for how long? I backed away, my eyes fixed on the door as it shook harder, the scraping sound now deafening, as if it was trying to claw its way inside. The door wouldn't hold much longer. Desperation surged through me. I had to get out. I glanced at the small window above the sink in the back room, just big enough to squeeze through. The door cracked, wood splintering. The window was my only chance. I pulled myself up onto the counter, forcing the window open, rain pouring in as I pushed my way through, my legs scrambling to the other side. Just as I was halfway out, the door burst open behind me. I didn't dare look back. I kicked hard, tumbling onto the wet pavement outside, scrambling to my feet and running blindly into the rain. I ran until my lungs burned, until I could no longer hear the breathing or the scraping, until the gas station was nothing but a speck of light in the distance. I didn't stop running until I reached the next town. I never went back to that gas station. When I told my manager I quit, he didn't even ask why. Maybe he knew. Maybe that's why the night shift was always available. But sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet, I still hear it. The scraping, the breathing. And I wonder if it's still looking for me. The wind howled through the empty parking lot as I pulled up to the hospital for my first night shift. I was a new security guard, freshly hired to patrol the old, nearly abandoned wing of the building. The hospital had been around for decades, and parts of it were still in use, but most of the original structure was closed off, a relic of another era. They called it the South Wing. It was a maze of crumbling hallways, dark rooms, and locked doors, sealed off from the public for years. My job was simple: keep an eye on the place, make sure no one got in. Vandalism, they said. Teenagers breaking in on dares. It seemed easy enough, boring even. But when I walked through the front doors that night, I felt it immediately, an odd, oppressive weight in the air, like the building itself was watching me. The lights flickered slightly as I swiped my ID card and headed down the long, narrow hallway leading to the south wing. At the end of the hall was a large metal door, marked with faded signs that warned of restricted access. The key they gave me slid easily into the lock, and with a creak, the door swung open. Cold air rushed out, carrying with it a faint, musty smell. The place hadn't been touched in years, judging by the dust that coated everything. My flashlight cut through the darkness as I stepped inside, the beam illuminating cracked tiles, broken windows, and long-abandoned hospital equipment. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hear things you shouldn't. I walked down the first hallway, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud against the walls. Every room I passed was empty, but it felt like they weren't, like something was just out of sight, watching me from the shadows. I told myself it was just nerves. New job, first night, a creepy old building. It was normal to feel uneasy. But then I heard it, a soft shuffle, like someone dragging their feet just behind me. I spun around, my flashlight swinging through the dark, but the hallway was empty. My pulse quickened. It had to be my imagination. I forced myself to keep walking, pretending not to notice the sudden chill that crept up my spine. I reached the end of the hall and turned into another corridor, this one longer and darker. The lights overhead flickered again, buzzing faintly. Just as I was about to continue my patrol, a faint voice whispered from the room to my left. "Help me." I froze. The words barely audible but unmistakable. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I stepped toward the door. It was partially open, revealing a dark room beyond. My gut told me to turn around, leave, but my feet carried me forward, curiosity outweighing the fear bubbling inside. I pushed the door open the rest of the way. The room was empty. No beds, no equipment, just cracked walls and debris scattered across the floor. But the air felt thick, wrong, like I'd stepped into something I shouldn't have. I turned to leave, my heart pounding in my chest. "Please, don't leave me." The voice again, closer this time, almost pleading. But there was no one there. I backed out of the room, my hands shaking as I pulled the door shut. I needed to get out of the south wing. Something wasn't right. I hurried down the hall, my footsteps quicker, my breath shallow. The sound of shuffling footsteps followed me again, but this time they were louder, faster, as if something was right behind me. I reached the main hall and fumbled with the radio on my belt, trying to call the front desk. Static. Only static. I cursed under my breath and continued toward the exit, my pace quickening when I heard it, something that froze the blood in my veins. A child's laughter, high-pitched, eerie, and echoing through the hallways behind me. It wasn't just a laugh, it was mocking, cruel, like it knew I was scared and was enjoying it. I turned, flashlight trembling as the beam darted through the darkness. At the end of the hall, just outside the door I had locked earlier, stood a little girl. She wore a hospital gown, her hair dark and wet, clinging to her pale face. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and fixed on me. The grin on her face was too wide, unnatural, like her skin was being stretched. My stomach churned. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. She took a step forward, her bare feet making no sound against the floor. Another step, her head tilting to the side as her grin grew wider. My legs finally responded, and I bolted toward the exit, not daring to look back. The laughter followed me, echoing in the halls, growing louder with each step I took. I reached the door, yanked it open, and slammed it behind me, locking it with shaking hands. The laughter stopped. I stood there, panting, heart hammering in my chest, staring at the door. Silence, the kind that was deafening. My flashlight flickered once, then went out completely, plunging me into total darkness. And then, from the other side of the door, came the sound of fingernails scratching against the metal. Slow, deliberate, and then a soft voice, barely audible through the thick door. "You can't leave me here." I ran out of that hospital and never looked back. I quit the next day. They didn't even ask why. Maybe they'd heard it before, maybe they knew. But the scariest part, the hospital had been closed for years. No patients, no staff, no children. So what was that girl? Some nights I still hear her laughter echoing in my dreams, and I wonder if she ever really let me go. The old diner sat at the edge of town, nestled between an abandoned gas station and a long-forgotten motel. No one went there anymore, except for the truckers desperate for a bite on their late-night hauls and the occasional lost soul passing through. It had a reputation, the kind that lingered in whispered conversations and knowing glances. People said strange things happened on the night shift, but I needed the money, and I didn't believe in ghost stories. Not then. I started working the overnight shift a few weeks back. The manager, Frank, seemed relieved when I took the job, like he was waiting for someone new to come along. He didn't tell me much, just to keep the place clean, serve the occasional customer, and, most importantly, never go into the basement. It was an old building, and the basement was probably full of mold and rusting pipes. I didn't ask any more questions. The first few nights were uneventful. The diner was always empty after midnight, and the hours dragged by. I'd clean the counters, check my phone, and sometimes listen to the radio to pass the time. Occasionally, a trucker would wander in, order coffee and pie, and leave without much conversation. But it was quiet. Too quiet. It was a Thursday night around 3 a.m. when things started to feel wrong. I was standing behind the counter flipping through an old magazine when I heard it, a faint tapping sound. It was soft, rhythmic, like someone gently knocking. At first, I thought it was coming from the window, maybe some debris from the highway hitting the glass, but as I listened closer, I realized it was coming from beneath me, the basement. I brushed it off, reminding myself that old buildings make strange noises. The pipes were probably clanking, or maybe some critters had made a home down there. But the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was trying to get my attention. I ignored it, trying to focus on my tasks, but my mind kept wandering back to Frank's warning. Why had he been so specific about the basement? What was down there that I wasn't supposed to see? The tapping continued, relentless, a steady beat that seemed to vibrate through the floor beneath my feet. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the keys from the hook behind the counter and made my way to the basement door at the back of the kitchen. My hand hesitated on the knob, Frank's words echoing in my head, but I was curious, too curious. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. The smell hit me first. Damp, earthy, with a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. The air was cold, much colder than it had any right to be for a summer night. My flashlight flickered as I shone it down the narrow staircase, the beam barely cutting through the thick darkness. The tapping had stopped. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The walls were lined with old, peeling paint, and I could see the pipes above me, dripping with condensation. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement opened into a large, cluttered room filled with old diner equipment, boxes of dusty supplies, and discarded furniture. It was as abandoned as I had expected. But then I saw it. In the far corner of the basement, partially hidden behind a stack of old chairs, was a door. It was small, almost child-sized, and unlike the rest of the basement, it looked new. The wood was dark, polished, and the handle gleamed like it had been recently used. My heart raced as I approached it, the air growing colder with every step. The door shouldn't have been there. The layout of the diner didn't have a room in that direction. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the doorknob. It was freezing. I turned it slowly and pushed the door open. Behind it was a narrow hallway lit by a faint, flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere. The walls were smooth, too smooth, like they were carved from stone. As I stepped inside, I could hear something, breathing. Slow, heavy, like someone was just around the corner, waiting. Every instinct told me to turn back, but I couldn't. I needed to know what was down here, what was causing the tapping, the strange feeling that had been gnawing at me for days. I took another step, then another, until the hallway opened into a small circular room. In the center of the room stood a single chair, and sitting in that chair was a man. His back was to me, and he was hunched over, his head hanging low, his hands resting on his knees. The dim light flickered above him, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted across the walls. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. The man didn't move. I stepped closer, the sound of my own breathing filling the silence. As I approached, I noticed something strange about him. His clothes were old, tattered, like they hadn't been changed in years. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his fingers, they were long, unnaturally long, with nails that looked they hadn't been cut in decades. "Sir," I reached out, my hand hovering just above his shoulder. In an instant, his head snapped up and he turned to face me. My heart stopped. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide and sunken, filled with an unnatural hunger. But what terrified me the most was his mouth, stitched shut with thick, black thread. He stared at me, his body shaking as if he was trying to scream, to say something, but the stitches held him silent. I stumbled backward, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. The man stood up, his movements jerky, like a puppet on strings, and began to shuffle toward me, his stitched mouth opening and closing as if trying to speak. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the diner, the basement door slamming shut behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The tapping had started again, this time louder, faster, like it was pounding in time with my heartbeat. I never went back to that basement. I told Frank I couldn't work there anymore, and he just nodded, like he knew. Like he'd heard it all before. I never found out who or what that man was, or why his mouth had been sewn shut. But some nights, when the wind is howling and the night is still, I swear I can still hear that tapping. And I wonder if one day he'll find his way out.